Daniel Foster had always believed that architecture was not only about drawing clean lines on paper or constructing facades that pleased the eye, but about shaping the way people lived inside those spaces. When he bought the old suburban house 2 years ago, it was not simply because of the generous interior or the charming garden tucked behind the maple trees, but because of the long, carefully paved driveway that wound from the street up to the entrance like a private passageway. The driveway was wide, framed with decorative stone edges and small solar lamps he had installed himself, and for Daniel it was the crowning element of the property, the subtle gesture that turned the house from an ordinary suburban residence into a composition of balance and order. Neighbors might have seen only a slab of concrete bordered by hedges, but Daniel knew it was more than that. As an architect who had spent years trying to impose a sense of logic on chaotic construction projects, he valued this driveway as his personal signature, a controlled threshold between the public world and his own domain. When he returned home late from the office, tired from reviewing blueprints and negotiating with clients, it was that slow roll along the stones, the sound of the tires crunching rhythmically, that reassured him he was finally crossing into a space that belonged entirely to him. Life had settled into a pattern that suited him. He was not an eccentric loner nor a recluse, just a man who preferred calm order after long days in the city. His weekends were spent working on small projects around the property, repairing shutters, experimenting with landscaping, and refining the exterior so it reflected the same care he invested in his professional designs. Occasionally, neighbors would pass by and comment on how perfectly maintained his driveway looked, how the paving stones gleamed after the rain, and Daniel felt a discreet sense of pride. This was not vanity, but rather the quiet satisfaction of someone who had created harmony with his own hands. He did not attend many of the homeowners' association events, not because he opposed them, but because he often found their discussions about pool colors and hedge heights uninspiring compared to the intensity of his daily work. He paid the dues, followed the rules when reasonable, and expected in return only one thing: to be left in peace on his property. When summer began, he looked forward to evenings spent sketching on the porch while the light dimmed, to reading while the solar lamps lit the driveway with a soft glow. The driveway became more than an access road. It was where neighborhood children sometimes played basketball when he invited them. It was where he washed his car on Saturdays. It was where friends parked when they came over for dinner. To Daniel, every line of stone was part of a lived-in design, a subtle integration of architecture and daily life. His home was not a fortress nor a spectacle. It was a carefully arranged composition that grounded him. He could never have imagined that the very element of his property that had given him such pride and tranquility would soon become the source of a conflict that would shatter his expectations of stability, draw his neighbors into bitter divisions, and reveal the corrupt undercurrent beneath the polite facade of suburban order. The driveway, which for him symbolized ownership, boundary, and creative expression, was about to be transformed into something grotesque and chaotic, a stage for disputes he never invited, and a symbol of how fragile personal control can be when others see opportunity in what you hold sacred. It began with noise, not the kind of distant background sound that usually drifts across a suburban neighborhood, but a dense and persistent hum that seemed to press against the walls of Daniel's house and disturb the stillness of the morning. At first, he thought it was some construction crew working on the main road, perhaps repairing utilities, and he allowed himself a few more minutes before stepping onto the porch with his coffee in hand. What he saw made him pause mid-step. The entire stretch of his carefully designed driveway, the surface that he had laid out with such precision and care, was no longer a quiet threshold to his home, but a chaotic avenue, crowded with food trucks of every shape and color, their bright paintwork and gaudy banners announcing tacos, fried dough, barbecue skewers, and iced coffee. There were tents strung with cheap plastic lights, portable generators coughing out fumes, and a line of people already forming as if this were a street festival. Daniel stood frozen, unable to comprehend how something like this had unfolded overnight, how his private property had been transformed into a marketplace without a word of warning. Children ran across the stones, leaving sticky trails of spilled soda, while music blared from one of the trucks, a distorted bass line that rattled against the glass of his living room windows. Strangers leaned against his hedges, using them as benches, and two men unloaded crates directly onto his grass, stomping across the flower beds as if they were mere obstacles in their setup. Daniel descended the steps quickly, trying to be heard above the din, asking who had authorized this, who had decided that his driveway could host a carnival. Most of the vendors ignored him, treating him as though he were just another passerby complaining about the wait times, until finally he spotted Evelyn Moore, the president of the Homeowners Association, standing near a truck that sold crepes, laughing with another neighbor and holding a clipboard. She was dressed as if attending some community fair she had orchestrated. Perfectly groomed hair, a tailored jacket despite the summer heat, and an expression of satisfaction as though everything were unfolding according to a carefully arranged plan. When Daniel approached her, his voice taut with disbelief, she greeted him with a calm smile and explained almost cheerfully that the association had reached an agreement with several food vendors to bring variety and energy into the neighborhood, to make it more vibrant and appealing. She gestured toward the trucks as if unveiling a civic improvement project. Daniel cut her off, demanding to know why his driveway was being used as the staging ground, why his property had been treated as though it were a public square. Evelyn's expression shifted only slightly, a cool firmness replacing her cheer. She explained that according to community records, his driveway had once been marked as an easement, a shared access point designated for community use decades ago, and therefore the association had every right to permit temporary events that served the neighborhood. He countered sharply that his title documents stated no such thing, that he had purchased this land with clear boundaries, and that the driveway was his alone. Evelyn listened with the practiced patience of someone used to neutralizing dissent, her smile never fully fading, and assured him that perhaps his copy of the documents did not reflect the most recent updates. The words hit him with the chill of something more sinister than bureaucratic miscommunication. Updates. It implied that someone had been rewriting the history of his property, reshaping its legal status without his consent, and doing so quietly enough that he had never noticed. He tried to push through the crowd of vendors, telling them to leave, insisting they had no right to be there, but most looked at him with irritation or outright dismissal, muttering that they had paid for their spaces and he should take it up with the association. Paid. That single word deepened the sick knot in his stomach. Not only had the HOA arranged this, but money had exchanged hands, money earned by using what belonged to him. He realized with a surge of fury that Evelyn was not simply promoting community spirit. She was profiting from it directly, renting out his driveway as though it were her personal asset to monetize. The situation escalated within minutes. When Daniel attempted to block the path of a van that was backing onto the stones, the driver waved a slip of paper at him, declaring that he had a permit issued by the HOA. Daniel snatched it, scanning the lines quickly, and saw his own address typed at the top under the title, Community Access Zone. The page bore a seal, not of the city or county, but of the association, a neatly embossed crest that looked official at first glance but carried no governmental authority. Still, in the eyes of the vendors, it was all they needed, and they brushed past him, confident that the president's paperwork outweighed the owner's protest. Daniel's voice rose above the noise as he tried to tell them they were trespassing, but his words were swallowed by laughter, by the hiss of grills, by the loudspeaker announcing, "Grand Opening Day of the Fair." It was as though his own land had been seized by a mob with banners and balloons, the sense of personal control he had cherished evaporating in a haze of fried food and amplified music. Evelyn touched his arm lightly, with that condescending gentleness reserved for those who just don't understand, and told him he should consider himself fortunate. Not every homeowner's property could serve the community in such a valuable way. He pulled his arm back, unable to mask the disgust twisting his face, and told her plainly that this was theft dressed as civic duty. Her smile thinned, and in a tone that carried the quiet weight of threat, she said, "The association's bylaws grant us broad discretion. If you push against this, you'll only isolate yourself from the neighborhood." It was then that Daniel understood she had no intention of backing down, that this festival was not an accident or temporary inconvenience, but the deliberate beginning of something larger. His driveway was being redefined not just socially but legally, claimed under a fabricated narrative of shared access, and unless he acted, his ownership would dissolve beneath layers of fraudulent documents and smiling justifications. He returned to his house, but the walls could not keep out the din or the realization that his life had been invaded. From the window, he saw people dancing where his car usually rested, children hanging off the basketball hoop he had installed for his nephews, vendors hammering stakes into the ground as if planting their own flags. He thought of the years spent designing spaces for others, how careful he had been in balancing aesthetics with rights of use, and felt a bitter irony that his own creation was being dismantled not by natural disaster or neglect, but by the calculated maneuver of a neighbor who wore professionalism like armor. The driveway that had symbolized his control had been stolen in plain sight, and with it, the certainty that property lines were inviolable. What began that morning was not just noise or inconvenience, but a revelation. His sanctuary could be transformed overnight into a carnival ground, and the authority behind it would claim to be law itself. The first days after the so-called community fair were the hardest Daniel had ever spent in that house, because the sense of trespass did not dissolve once the food trucks left for the evening, but instead lingered in every stain left on the paving, stones, in the smell of grease that clung to the hedges, and in the scraps of paper and plastic lodged between the decorative stones he had once polished with such care. He walked the length of the driveway that Sunday night, after the last generator had gone silent, and felt as though he were surveying a battlefield that had been lost without even the dignity of a fight, a place conquered by smiling vendors and a neighbor who spoke of bylaws as if they were divine commandments. He told himself it might have been a single event, a misguided initiative that would not repeat. But the following Friday he returned from work to find the same scene unfolding again with even greater confidence, as if the first weekend had legitimized the practice. More trucks, more lights, more people, and at the center of it all, Evelyn, clipboard in hand, greeting guests like a host receiving them at her personal estate. Daniel confronted her again, his words sharper than before, and demanded to see the legal basis for what she continued to call an easement. This time she did not merely cite bylaws, but produced a document that bore the appearance of authority. A plat map stamped with a notary's seal and highlighting the stretch of his driveway as a community access corridor. At first glance, the inked lines looked official, the typewritten text precise, the signature neatly placed, yet Daniel's eyes, trained by years of architectural scrutiny, caught irregularities. The proportions of the lot did not match the dimensions in his deed, and the date on the seal was 2 decades later than the year the notary whose name appeared had retired. He accused her directly of presenting falsified paperwork, but she brushed his words aside, claiming he simply misunderstood technical mapping conventions. When he insisted that the vendors leave immediately, Evelyn made a show of calling over 2 security officers she had hired for the event, men in reflective vests who positioned themselves between him and the trucks as though he were the trespasser. The humiliation of being pushed back on his own land, while neighbors looked on with expressions ranging from amusement to thinly veiled judgment, left him simmering with a helpless fury. Some neighbors even applauded Evelyn, thanking her for bringing life to the block, their voices carrying loud enough for him to hear, each word a reminder that the crowd was against him and that his protests were being framed as selfish resistance to communal joy. One elderly man shouted that Daniel should stop acting like he owned the entire neighborhood, and laughter followed, twisting the reality of his ownership into an accusation of arrogance. Later that evening, determined not to allow this charade to continue unchecked, he drove downtown to the county records office, where after several hours of navigating indifferent clerks and endless stacks of microfilmed documents, he located the official plat registered at the time of his purchase. The lines were clear, the driveway fully enclosed within his parcel, and no notation of shared access or easement was recorded. He requested certified copies, clutching them as though they were weapons he would need for a coming war, and returned home with a grim sense of purpose. Yet, when he attempted to present these documents to Evelyn the next day, she dismissed them with a patronizing shake of the head, saying that outdated records often linger in county archives, and that the association's files superseded them. What unsettled Daniel even more than her audacity was the reaction of the vendors themselves, who no longer treated him as the owner at all. One man selling hot dogs laughed openly when Daniel told him to pack up, waving a receipt that showed a payment made directly to the HOA. "I rent this space fair and square," the man said, as though Daniel were merely a cranky local trying to muscle him out. Another vendor, a woman selling fruit smoothies, suggested he should be grateful because the festival was raising the profile of the neighborhood, and therefore increasing his property's value. Each word cut deeper because it revealed the extent of the illusion Evelyn had constructed. By repeating the fiction of community ownership and producing forged documents, she had convinced outsiders and neighbors alike that his driveway was no longer truly his. The tension escalated when Daniel attempted a more direct tactic. He parked his own car sideways across the entrance, intending to block the trucks from entering. For a brief moment it worked, and the first van in line stopped abruptly, its driver leaning on the horn. People gathered quickly, muttering, irritated that their entertainment was being delayed. Evelyn appeared, her voice carrying above the crowd, accusing Daniel of obstructing a sanctioned community event and warning that such behavior would be noted in HOA violation reports. When he refused to move, she called the local police, and within 20 minutes a patrol car arrived. To his dismay, the officers spoke to Evelyn first, listening gravely as she presented her folder of authorizations, and then approached Daniel with the weary tone of men who preferred to avoid paperwork. Though they acknowledged it was a civil matter, they urged him to de-escalate, to move his vehicle, suggesting that if he had disputes about property lines, he should take it up with the courts. Surrounded by vendors, neighbors, and officers who treated him as the disruptive party, Daniel felt the crushing weight of isolation settle over him. He moved the car, but inside he knew he had ceded more than space. He had surrendered the perception of authority over his own land. That night he walked the driveway again, tracing the stains left by oil from the trucks, the ruts in the soil where tents had been anchored, and the fragments of confetti blowing against the stones. He thought of the hours he had spent designing this space, of the pride he had once felt when neighbors commented on its elegance, and realized with bitter clarity that he was no longer regarded as its master. Evelyn had rewritten the narrative, recasting him as an obstacle, a petty figure standing in the way of the progress, while she profited from the spectacle. The betrayal was not only personal, but systemic. Documents forged, officials indifferent, neighbors complicit. For the first time, he recognized that this was not a conflict that would resolve through polite discussion or a single piece of paperwork. It was a struggle that would demand endurance, precision, and an unflinching willingness to confront corruption at its root. As he locked his door against the muffled music still echoing from down the street, Daniel understood he had crossed the line between inconvenience and battle, and the escalation had only just begun. Daniel's frustration had reached a level where exhaustion and anger blurred into a single determination to uncover the truth, because he understood now that arguing with Evelyn on the street or shouting at vendors who waved their receipts would lead him nowhere. The only weapon strong enough to pierce the shield of polite lies she wielded so fluently was a documented proof, something undeniable, something that would not wilt under the weight of her smooth explanations or staged paperwork. He began spending his evenings in the county archives, poring over decades of property records, tracing every change of ownership, every plat filed, every easement granted in the neighborhood, his architect's eye spotting inconsistencies others might have missed. The deeper he went, the clearer it became that the supposed designation of his driveway as community access had never existed in the legitimate records, and that the sudden emergence of maps bearing such marks was not a matter of administrative error but of deliberate invention. Still, the problem remained. Who would believe him without someone else to corroborate that this scheme had been brewing for years? The answer came in an unexpected form when he reached out to the previous owner, a woman named Margaret Howard, who had sold the property more than a decade earlier and now lived in an assisted living facility on the other side of town. At first, she was confused by his call, her memory faltering, but when Daniel explained that the association was claiming his driveway as communal property, she let out a weary sigh and told him she had faced the same pressure years ago. She described how, shortly before she sold the house, members of the HOA had insisted she sign an agreement granting them partial control of the driveway, arguing it would be for maintenance purposes and in everyone's best interest. She had refused, suspicious of their insistence, and afterward received a series of letters laced with thinly veiled threats that her property value would decline if she did not cooperate. Margaret confessed she had kept one of those letters, a yellowed piece of paper folded inside a box of old documents, because it had frightened her so much that she could never quite throw it away. Daniel drove out to meet her, carrying flowers as a gesture of respect, and sat across from her in the quiet visiting room of the facility. She handed him the letter with trembling hands, and as he read the sharp lines of legal intimidation, signed not by Evelyn but by an earlier board president, he felt a chill run through him. The tactics had not changed, only the faces had. The association had been trying to claim this strip of land for decades, and where they once failed through pressure, they now attempted to succeed through forgery. Margaret clasped his hand and said softly, "They think no one will ever fight them long enough. But you're younger. Maybe you can." Her words carried the gravity of a passing torch, and Daniel left the facility with a renewed sense of resolve, the fragile sheet of paper more valuable than any architectural plan he had ever drafted. Back at his house, he spread his growing collection of evidence across the dining table. The certified plats from the county archives, the dubious community corridor map Evelyn had flaunted, and Margaret's letter. Side by side, the contradictions screamed of manipulation. Yet Daniel knew the association would never admit wrongdoing willingly. He needed an advocate who could force their hand in a venue they could not control. That led him to a local attorney named Claire Donovan, recommended by a colleague at his firm who had once battled a homeowners association over zoning violations. Claire was sharp, quick-eyed, and had the kind of controlled patience that made her opponents underestimate her until it was too late. She listened carefully as Daniel laid out his case, asking pointed questions, flipping through each document with the practiced hand of someone who had spent years unmasking bureaucratic deceit. By the end of their meeting, she leaned back and said, "This isn't sloppy paperwork. This is intentional fraud. They're counting on you giving up before you can prove it." With Claire's guidance, Daniel filed a formal complaint with the county recorder's office, demanding an investigation into the authenticity of the HOA's documents. At the same time, she sent Evelyn a letter challenging the association's legal authority over the property and demanding the immediate cessation of all events on his driveway. Evelyn's reply came swiftly, a glossy packet of supposed bylaws and amendments that declared the driveway part of a shared improvement zone. Yet when Claire compared the signatures on those amendments with samples from public filings, she discovered something striking. Evelyn's distinctive looping signature appeared in documents dated years before she had even become president of the HOA. It was the smoking gun they needed, proof that the records had been doctored retroactively. The next weekend, however, the trucks still rolled in as if nothing had happened, their engines growling against Daniel's sense of justice. He stood at his window watching the lights flicker, the strangers wandering across his stones, and for the first time he felt not only anger, but the creeping sensation of being displaced in his own home. The psychological toll was mounting. He no longer walked his driveway at night because the stains and trash reminded him of defeat. He stopped inviting friends over because the noise and chaos made conversation impossible. His house, once his sanctuary, had become an island surrounded by a carnival that mocked his ownership. And Evelyn, always smiling, always speaking as if she were the guardian of community spirit, seemed to grow more emboldened with every festival that went unchallenged. Then came the revelation that shifted Daniel's anger into a sharper, almost cold determination. Claire managed to obtain internal emails from a vendor who had grown uneasy about the arrangement. In one of them, Evelyn explicitly instructed the vendors not to worry about the property owner's objections, assuring them that the paperwork is handled and that Daniel is too inexperienced to challenge us effectively. Reading those words, Daniel felt the last vestige of self-doubt fall away. They were not only using him, they were mocking him, dismissing him as a naive professional who would eventually tire of the fight. The thought ignited something deeper than indignation. It became personal, not just about defending a strip of land, but about proving that his resolve could outlast the polished corruption of Evelyn's leadership. By the end of that week, Daniel and Claire had prepared a comprehensive file for court. Certified plats, the threatening letter from Margaret's past, the fraudulent amendments with Evelyn's signature, and the incriminating email. They were ready to force the conflict into a space where Evelyn's smile and charm could not override hard evidence. Daniel felt the pressure of isolation lifting slightly because he now carried allies beside him, but he also knew the battle ahead would not be clean. Evelyn had held her position for years, weaving connections with neighbors, vendors, and even local officials, and she would not relinquish her control without striking back. Standing once again at the edge of his driveway, watching yet another truck roll across his stones as though it were a public street, he whispered to himself that the midpoint had passed. The illusion of negotiation was over. From here on, it was war fought with documents, testimony, and endurance, and he had no intention of losing. The legal steps Daniel had taken with Claire's guidance should have been enough to at least slow the association, yet instead of retreating, Evelyn seemed to treat every challenge as fuel, as if his resistance gave her greater reason to assert control. Within a week of the court filing, Daniel began receiving letters on HOA stationery accusing him of violating neighborhood standards, citing infractions that bordered on absurd: the angle of his porch lights, the placement of his recycling bin, the shade of mulch in his garden beds. Each letter carried the weight of fines, piling up into figures that no reasonable homeowner could accept without protest, and each one arrived with unnerving precision, always timed just after he and Claire submitted another piece of evidence. Against her. It was clear retaliation, a campaign not just to overwhelm him with paperwork, but to erode his patience and paint him as a delinquent in the eyes of his neighbors. The vendors, sensing Evelyn's protection, grew bolder as well. They no longer limited themselves to the stones of his driveway, but began spreading chairs and portable tables onto the edges of his lawn, hammering small stakes into the soil to string their banners, leaving deep ruts in the ground that filled with muddy water after rain. Daniel confronted one of them, a heavy-set man who sold barbecue skewers, and demanded he remove his equipment. But the man sneered and said he had permission from the people who actually run this neighborhood. The dismissal cut more sharply than the physical damage because it showed that Evelyn's narrative had taken full hold. In the public eye, Daniel was no longer the rightful authority over his own land. What deepened the wound was the reaction of the community around him. At the next neighborhood gathering, which he attended at Claire's urging to demonstrate that he was not withdrawing from civic life, he heard neighbors whispering about how he was dragging everyone into his personal feud. Evelyn, standing gracefully at the front of the room, presented charts of how the festivals had boosted neighborhood visibility, claiming property values were already rising as a result of the vibrant atmosphere. Several residents applauded, and when Daniel attempted to raise the issue of forged documents, Evelyn interrupted smoothly, telling the group that legal matters are being handled privately and that it was not appropriate to sow division during a community meeting. The applause that followed was not thunderous but steady enough to isolate him, to turn his insistence on truth into the appearance of pettiness. He left the meeting with the hollow awareness that Evelyn had not merely invaded his land but had weaponized public perception against him. Determined not to be silenced, Daniel tried again to block the festival, this time chaining a temporary barrier across the entrance of the driveway before dawn, hoping to prevent the trucks from entering at all. For a few hours the street remained clear, and he allowed himself the brief relief of silence. Yet by mid-morning Evelyn arrived with 2 men carrying bolt cutters, and without hesitation they severed the chain, rolling it aside as though it were nothing more than debris. She smiled at him across the distance, and, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear, said, "You see, Daniel, obstruction will not change the fact that this space belongs to all of us." Her tone carried the double sting of dominance and performance, for the words were not addressed to him alone but to every neighbor watching, reinforcing her role as benevolent leader against his role as obstinate holdout. The humiliation was sharpened further when, that same evening, his mailbox was defaced with garish paint, the word "selfish" scrawled across its side. Though he could not prove who had done it, the timing was too exact to be coincidence. When he called the police, they logged the incident but showed little urgency, reminding him again that many of his issues with the association were civil disputes, and suggesting that he should work them out through mediation. He hung up with the bitter realization that the machinery of local enforcement had little interest in distinguishing between forged documents and genuine bylaws. As long as Evelyn cloaked her actions in the language of community, she remained untouchable. Inside his own home, the pressure took on an almost psychological quality. The noise of the festivals seeped through the windows even with them shut, making sleep difficult while the stench of frying oil settled into the curtains and carpets until he felt his sanctuary smelled no different from the makeshift fair outside. Friends stopped visiting, saying politely that they did not want to be caught in the middle of neighborhood politics, and even his colleagues began to ask why he looked perpetually tired. His architectural sketches, once the source of his pride and calm, grew sloppy as his concentration fractured. It became evident that the battle was no longer confined to property lines. Evelyn's campaign was slowly consuming the fabric of his life. Claire urged him to hold steady, reminding him that the evidence was on their side, but Daniel found it harder each day to push back against the sense of being outnumbered. What unnerved him most was not the open hostility but the small gestures. Neighbors crossing the street rather than greet him, children whispering and pointing as though he were a pariah, and vendors who waved cheerfully at Evelyn while glaring at him with thinly veiled contempt. The driveway, once a symbol of his control and his art, had been transformed into a stage for his humiliation, and Evelyn directed the performance with a steady hand, orchestrating every cheer, every banner, every official letter that darkened his mailbox. One evening, standing at his window, Daniel realized he was no longer fighting simply for land, but for dignity itself. The escalation had reached a point where silence would mean surrender, and surrender would mean living the rest of his days as the man who lost his home, not to thieves in the night, but to neighbors in broad daylight, applauding as his property was. Rewritten into their festival grounds, he clenched his fists and told himself the war was not yet lost, because as much as Evelyn had mastered perception, she had also grown careless in her arrogance. Somewhere in the paper trail of forged amendments and misdated signatures was the thread that would unravel her entire scheme, and he intended to find it before the carnival atmosphere outside swallowed his life completely. The courtroom did not look like the kind of battlefield Daniel had envisioned during the long nights of noise and humiliation. Yet, as he sat at the polished wooden table beside Claire, he felt the same tense anticipation that soldiers must feel before a decisive engagement, because the months of gathering evidence, the hours of frustration and doubt, all now funneled into a single confrontation where words, signatures, and dates would determine whether his driveway remained his own or became forever rewritten as communal property. Evelyn entered with her usual composure, dressed in a navy suit that projected authority, her smile measured, as if this were merely another committee meeting where she would silence dissent with a polished phrase. She nodded to neighbors who had come to observe, a small crowd whispering expectantly, some curious, others openly aligned with her cause. Daniel caught a few hostile glances in his direction, the silent accusation that he was wasting everyone's time, that he was the one dragging the community through unnecessary drama. But he forced his focus on the judge, reminding himself that this was not a popularity contest but a matter of law. The proceedings began with Evelyn's attorney presenting the so-called amendments to the HOA bylaws, documents that purported to show that years earlier the community had voted to classify his driveway as a shared access corridor. The attorney spoke with confidence, pointing to the embossed seals and flowing signatures as if these alone carried the weight of truth, and several observers nodded as though the case was already closed. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he waited for Claire, who rose with deliberate calm and began her dismantling not with fiery rhetoric, but with surgical precision. She presented the certified plats from the county archives, their official stamps clearly predating the forged amendments, showing beyond doubt that the property lines had never included any communal access. She then laid Margaret Howard's letter before the judge, explaining how the association had attempted to pressure the previous owner with threats, proof that the scheme to seize control of the driveway stretched back decades. The judge read the letter carefully, his brow tightening, while Evelyn shifted slightly in her chair, her polished mask flickering for the briefest second. The turning point came when Claire unveiled the expert handwriting analysis comparing Evelyn's signature across multiple documents. On the screen projected for the court appeared overlays of her distinctive looping flourish, identical across filings allegedly separated by nearly 15 years. The analyst's report concluded that the same hand had signed amendments that predated Evelyn's official tenure, meaning they could not be authentic. The murmur that rippled through the courtroom was sharp, a collective intake of breath as the audience absorbed the accusation of fraud. Evelyn's attorney objected, claiming coincidence, but the judge overruled him, noting that the probability of such perfect matches across decades was statistically negligible. Daniel felt a surge of vindication but kept his expression steady, unwilling to give Evelyn the satisfaction of seeing his triumph before the ruling was declared. As if that were not enough, Claire then produced the email obtained from the uneasy vendor, the line where Evelyn assured her partners that Daniel was too inexperienced to challenge us effectively. The judge read the email aloud, his voice carrying across the room, and the words hung in the air with damning clarity. For the first time, Evelyn's composure cracked. She pressed her lips together, her eyes hardening, but the aura of untouchable authority had been punctured. Neighbors who had once whispered against Daniel now looked at her with unease, the shift in perception almost tangible. The final blow came when the county recorder's representative, summoned by subpoena, testified that no record of the so-called easement existed in their official archives and that the amendments Evelyn relied upon had never been filed through legitimate channels. With each statement, the weight of evidence built into an undeniable wall, and when the judge finally leaned forward to issue his decision, Daniel felt the months of strain pressing at his chest. The ruling was firm. The driveway was his private property. The HOA had no authority to lease it, and the presentation of forged documents constituted not only civil violation, but grounds for criminal investigation. The festivals were ordered to cease immediately. Damages would be calculated, and the case referred to the district attorney for review of possible charges against those responsible for the falsifications. The gavel struck, a sharp sound that echoed like the closing note of a symphony, and Daniel exhaled slowly, the knot of tension in his chest unraveling at last. Evelyn sat rigid, her smile gone, surrounded by murmurs of neighbors who no longer looked at her with admiration, but with suspicion, perhaps even betrayal. Daniel did not allow himself a gesture of celebration. The victory was not sweet, but heavy, laden with the memory of sleepless nights, defaced mailboxes, and the feeling of being erased in his own home. Yet it was victory nonetheless, and as he walked out of the courtroom into the clear daylight he felt, for the first time in months, that the stones of his driveway might once again sound beneath his tires not as the floor of a carnival, but as the threshold of his sanctuary, restored to him by the persistence that Evelyn had dismissed as weakness. When the dust of the trial settled, the food trucks vanished from the neighborhood as abruptly as they had appeared, leaving behind only faint tire scars on the stonework and the lingering smell of oil that took weeks of rain to finally wash away. Daniel stood on his porch in the evenings watching the driveway remain empty, and the silence, once something he had taken for granted, now felt like a reclaimed treasure, a fragile piece won through months of attrition. Yet the victory did not come without its residue, because although the court had affirmed his rights and ordered restitution, the atmosphere in the community was no longer one of simple suburban normalcy. Some neighbors avoided his gaze, embarrassed by the way they had cheered Evelyn and mocked him, while others continued to mutter that he had ruined something fun for everyone, as though truth and property meant less than the spectacle of weekend. Festivals. There were a few who offered quiet words of support, even apologies, but he understood that trust among neighbors, once fractured, does not knit back together easily. Evelyn resigned her position within a month, citing personal reasons, but Daniel knew she had been forced out by the weight of exposure and the looming possibility of charges. He sometimes saw her car pass quickly down the street without stopping, the proud wave gone, replaced by a shadow of the authority she had once projected so effortlessly. The association scrambled to reorganize, promising transparency and oversight, but Daniel had learned enough not to accept such promises at face value. He paid his dues when required, but no longer assumed the HOA's words were tied to legitimacy. And in that caution there was both wisdom and a touch of sorrow, because he realized he would never again look at the polite smiles of suburban order with the same untroubled trust. At home, he returned to his sketches, spreading plans across the table with steadier hands, the rhythm of pencil on paper restoring some of the calm that had been lost. Sometimes, though, he paused at the window, looking at the driveway where children once danced to the distorted music of rented speakers, and he felt a quiet weight in his chest, a memory of how close he had come to losing not just a strip of stone, but the very sense that his home was truly his. That knowledge would never leave him, but neither would the fact that he had stood against it and prevailed. The driveway remained what he had always intended it to be, not a carnival ground or a corridor for profit, but a line of order and design that led him back, each evening, into the space he had built for himself. And if the silence that followed felt heavier than before, it also carried dignity, a reminder carved into stone that even in the heart of suburbia, ownership is not given by the approval of neighbors, but defended by the resolve of the one who refuses to surrender it.